workshop is an initiative of Ikare Longevity, which is a community created around this purpose of helping people to live 100 years in good health. So there's been a decade or so since some scientific breakthroughs, significant breakthroughs in preventative medicine have changed the perspective over longevity and health span extension. Today, living 100 years in good health is no longer a pipe dream. It's an ambitious yet attainable goal. So we are on a mission with Ikare Longevity to help people and give them the necessary practical insights into how to live 100 years in good health. And we do this in two distinct ways. First, one is Ikare Longevity. Those workshops that are 100% free. We try to bring as much value as possible to people to give practical insights with those workshops. We invite keynote speakers with specific expertise in specific aspects of longevity. And Daniel is one of them. So thank you very much, Daniel, for joining and being our keynote speaker today.
Absolutely a pleasure.
You're welcome. For the people who want to get really serious about this and want to receive a personalized assistance, we have another service, which is ikare.ai, where we team each patient with a medical doctor with expertise in longevity and also a health coach to help him implement the doctor's recommendations into his or her daily life and turn those recommendations into consistent habits. Again, if you are curious and would like to have as much value as possible for free, please attend those workshops. We have brilliant people talking about longevity-related aspects. And again, if you want to have sort of a personal trainer when it comes to longevity, please don't hesitate to reach out to us and to find out more about this service that we have created. And for whom people are really satisfied, we receive every day positive feedback about this. So this being said, let's get going and introduce Daniel Kronbeck, who is an expert in physiological testing and respiratory training, who is going to give us an exclusive talk about metabolic testing, respiratory limitations and training, injury prediction and prevention, all this in relationship to longevity, of course. So the floor is yours, Daniel. Please go ahead. You can share your screen. I will stop sharing mine.
Thank you very much.
So here we go.
Wonderful. As you can see here, today, obviously with 30 minutes, I can't cover everything there that I have a background in, but today we're going to cover physiological testing analysis and nutrition exercise programming in relation to longevity. How many people here and they have the ability to turn the mics on, right, Gabriel?
I do have my mic on. I don't know if you, maybe Jean-Baptiste and Anastasia can do so.
Do you guys have experience with physiological testing?
Yes, a bit.
To a certain extent.
Okay. VO2 a bit.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So let's get going. So this is my background. So I've a physiotherapist, sport physiotherapist, a clinical exercise physiologist, plus a chartered activity and health practitioner, certified strength and conditioning specialist, high performance specialist, and also associate fellow in higher education. This background, obviously over 30 years, has given me a whole different way of looking at longevity and health compared to others that are more kind of within their own purview or within their own silo. So this has always made it very interesting trying to have conversations with people because of the fact that you have all this different qualifications, certifications, as well as experience. My company is called Strategic Health and Performance, and I'm the director there, as well as I'm the director of sales for Europe and Africa for Core. And Core is a device manufacturer who makes metabolic analyzers. And I can say right from the beginning, I don't like the word metabolic analyzer, and because of the fact that we're not just looking at the metabolic systems, and I don't like using the word, kind of using the word VO2 max in here because that's not all it measures. And that's why I prefer to refer to it as physiological testing because of the fact that we look at multiple systems. At least we should, not just go looking for that one number that people are looking for. In addition to that, I'm a member of the Core Metabolic Science Advisory Board, so I work with the engineers and other members of the company to be able to improve the quality of our testing, the quality of our of the analysis, and our recommendation to those that choose to purchase a core device. I picked strategic because of the fact that I spent 30 years in the Army. And I believe that this type of approach needs to be taken when you're working with people, is you need to be able to be strategic with their health and performance, with your analysis and prescription of nutrition and exercise. And you'll notice that my logo has four arrows pointing towards a target. The target is health or function or performance, depending on the client that we're working with. And there's four arrows pointing to the center. One's representing cardiovascular, one representing respiratory, one it represents metabolic, and the last is musculoskeletal. Obviously, with me being a physiotherapist and a sport physiotherapist, that's my interest. Um, I picked it partly because I agreed with the definition of strategic, which is of relating to or characterized by the identification of long-term or overall aims and interests and means of achieving them. It makes it very clear that your job is to be able to identify the issues and then be able to develop systems in which you can improve them effectively and efficiently. And that's what I tell all my guys is to be strategic with your health and performance. So that's kind of my background. Um, the big thing with me is I have a diversity in training experience. You're looking at 30 years of experience in this field. Um, you're looking at not just 30, I did 30 years in the military, but I also went upon retirement, I was the head of rehab and performance working with Chinese Olympic athletes. I was their head therapist for the Winter Olympics in 2018 in Korea. From there, I was the head of science and education with Panoi, a Greek metabolic analysis company who builds has their own device. From there, I went to the University of Chichester and taught physiology and physiotherapy for 2 years. And now I live in Northern England, despite being Canadian. And I do not only testing locally and working with people here, but I also work with companies. For example, I work with a company that called Fit for Racing, where I organize a lot of the analysis of their downhill mountain bike racers. I do the analysis of their data and I do the program prescription based upon their results along with the mountain bike coach. And I also do analysis for internationally for people all over the world who do the testing, but they don't know how to analyze it properly. So they send it to me and I also teach. So it's entertaining days here, that's for sure. I've
Mhm.
also used a multitude of metabolic devices. So I first started off with Cosmed. I then moved over and worked with Panoi for 2 years. I've also used other Cosmed products, and I was involved in a validation study most recently, just last year, University of Maastricht, looking at 7 different metabolic analyzers. But I don't just work metabolic analysis because I feel that I need to have cross-reference uh, the data to be able to be absolutely sure about my recommendations. So I also used other testing parameters, which include lactate, which I did for 8 years. I don't do it anymore. I find lactate quite pointless, despite the fact that it's coming back in as being popular, mainly because people don't need to expend much money, the analysis of it is quite simple. But I find that if you're doing metabolic analysis, you do not need lactate information. And I find lactate information on its own relatively useless. So I'm not a fan, only because of the fact that I've got better ways of doing things. But I do incorporate near-infrared spectroscopy in my testing, which gives me the ability to look at oxygen delivery and utilization directly at the muscle cell. And I like to use that data with my metabolic data for zoning and looking at limitations. But I also use body composition. And about 20 years ago, I started doing spirometry because I started recognizing a huge number of respiratory limitations when testing people um, that other people weren't catching. So by doing spirometry, I can measure their respiratory capacity and then look at how well they can use those volumes during activity or even at rest. And therefore, I could pick up respiratory limitations that would make it look like the person maybe had a cardiovascular or a metabolic problem. So I'll go into that a little bit later as well. But spirometry gives me the ability to look at capacity, whereas the metabolic analysis, looking at tidal volumes or the amount of air they're breathing per breath and the breathing frequencies, gives me the ability to analyze how the respiratory system is working at different intensities. And I also work with diverse populations, all the way from medical through to elite athletes. And when I first started off, the first 8 or 10 years, it was all elite athletes. You get very good at that, but you don't know how to look at somebody from a general population, and then you definitely do not know how to work with people with a medical population or those that are on the cusp. In other words, the deconditioned general population, which is essentially not yet diagnosed as having a metabolic disorder or pre-diabetic or having a cardiovascular problem. I found that I got infinitely better with my analysis when I started working with the medical population because the physiology is not normal. And you could clearly see how that change in their physiology has affected their outputs of their systems. And they are as complex as elite athletes for prescribing the right exercise, dosage, intensity, as well as dealing with their nutrition. And lucky enough, I'm a respected international expert and educator. And I'll go a little bit more into the education programming because I just found that having the experience I have with the devices I have, there's people with devices that I have that just do not know how to analyze the data well at all. And they are leaving probably 75% of the important information on the table. Now, if you guys have any questions, I know, Gabriel, do you prefer people to ask questions at the end or can they butt in?
Usually people ask questions at the end, but it's not to say that it's rigid and carved into stone. So I'm starting to have questions, but again, I can either wait until the end of the
Okay.
presentation if this disturbs you or ask them right away.
Okay. Well, if you're collecting them, that's great. I'll just wait until the end then, and hopefully I'll cover some of the questions. But hopefully, I love the most entertaining part of this stuff is not this part; it's the interchange afterwards.
Mhm.
So, so as you can see, you're going to hear things from me that you don't hear from other people. I've educated over 1,000 people on metabolic testing, and I continue to do so. So, because I do believe that if any person is going to invest any money into testing, this is the most important testing to have done, but not for the traditional sense of looking for what their VO2 max is. That is so inconsequential compared to the other information that's provided. But unfortunately, out there, that's not well understood. So let's talk about longevity. The this this is from a 2024 article on insights on health span from Cell to Society. They looked at health span and longevity as being kind of made up of societal and cellular and clinical components. And obviously, the societal side, public health and consumer well-being, It's well beyond my capability to control. But yeah, it absolutely affects it. But in general, with the testing, it's not something that you would notice. For example, if I went to China, I would get different results with a group of people than I would than if I went to Canada, depending on what's available in their region itself and what they're exposed to. So, obviously there's significant issues with air quality in the larger cities in China, in particular the south. So therefore, you would expect that there would be more respiratory issues related to that, and those respiratory issues have profound effects on other systems itself. Something to observe, but not what I'm going to change or what I'm not going to promote to change within testing itself. Something to be aware of. But the clinical and the cellular side of the house is really where I work. In particular, the clinical side is on the diagnostic side, right? It is you're seeing all kinds of different approaches to diagnosis specific to longevity. You're seeing tons of people having blood profiles done, and I would say a blatant over exaggeration of what you can actually tell from their blood profiles. Not that they're not helpful, but I wish people would be more honest with what they can absolutely tell versus what they tout they can determine. Because it really does have really great value, but why don't they just stick with that instead of exaggerating the capabilities? And we have companies within the metabolic analysis world that do this all the time. Um, and it always disappoints me because of the fact that there is really good, valuable information. Why are you just happy with telling people the truth instead of trying to exaggerate the capabilities? So, and on the cellular side, obviously, I think of this as being more on the metabolic side, um, to be able to identify metabolic limitations and then be able to make decisions about how to improve them in order to improve longevity and health span itself. There's this article is really interesting because they look at it from a point of view that's slightly it's not on my path, but it is really interesting. Looking at I identified hallmarks of aging, which included disabled microautophagy, chronic inflammation, and dysbiosis, enhancing our understanding of aging process at a microscopic, cellular, and system-wide level. Um, Now, health span is defined as the period of life spent in optimal health and enjoying a good quality of life, and encompassing not just absence of illness and injury, but overall well-being, including physical, mental, and emotional health. And I think that's, what Gabrielle is really going after is the fact that it's complex. There's multiple factors feeding into these things. Some of them we can control, and some of them we can't. Things like genetics, obviously, but other things, emotional health, you know, getting proper counseling, being in good relationships, having good friends, and being social is extremely important side of it. Not really what I do, unless I pick up a personality that I think would benefit for, let's say, working out in a group or attending classes. If they tend to be more that way, you can move them that direction. But really, I concentrate much more on straight physiology and application of appropriate nutrition and exercise prescription. And then their statement in here was strategies to manipulate these hallmarks present opportunities for slowing, preventing, and reversing age-related diseases, thereby promoting longevity. And I agree with that 100%. What we have to do is find the controllable variables and be able to manipulate the controllable variables as much as we can. So everybody talks about a healthy lifestyle. So obviously that includes balanced nutrition, regular physical activity, and avoiding other harmful habits. And the reason why I like this description, and it's from an article in The Lancet in 2023, is because the fact that the first two are really uh, the parts that we'll talk about today is balanced nutrition and regular physical activity. But there's obviously diet plays a role. Physical activity are the first two that are the easiest to adapt and be able to make massive changes. Meanwhile, there's social connections, avoiding harmful substances, environmental factors, mental stimulation. And the statement in this is the overall a combination of healthy habits, social engagement, and environmental management contributes significantly to increased life expectancy. So we're going to really concentrate on the first two. So everybody knows out there that there's an importance in physical fitness. Most of you have probably seen this graph before. This is from a 2018 article uh, about VO2 max being a key predictor of longevity. And the idea is that if you look at the split in between independence and dependent living and the number of healthy years, and we target prevention between the ages of 40 and 60. In other words, we really want to make sure that we're taking people that are relatively sedentary and make them more active. We can have a profound effect on their number of healthy life years. And you can see that a sedentary person will drop off significantly earlier in their late years of being independent and healthy. And that what we want to do is you want to really kind of hit that age group where, and I would state even before that, it's when people are married and have children and they start developing habits that leads to less time for them to be able to dedicate themselves. But the things that you do in your 30s and 40s are extremely important to how long and how healthy you live in your later years. And they, in this particular article, they talked about the cutoff values are 17.5 milligrams per milliliters per kilogram per minute. In other words, essentially a VO2 number. But I also like the fact they use METs, and I've started using METs a lot more recently because I'm trying to get people to understand that metabolic equivalent is a measure of work that you can do at what intensity is actually something that's really valuable. So I've been working a lot with getting people to understand that we want you not only to improve your VO2 max, but we want also the work that you can do, that you can achieve at that level to also improve. So there's really good research, obviously, about VO2 max. The problem is, as soon as it gets out, especially now with the way media is now, everybody just starts using the same thing. What you've got to do is improve your VO2 max, and you're going, well, I don't know. I don't know whether that, I don't know what it is now. I don't know whether that's where you should spend most of your time. I know that exercise and nutrition are extremely important, but what exercise? What's going to have the most profound effect on your limitations and your goals for the future? And of course, on the other side, looking at nutrition, this is from an article in 2020. Just a simple statement: genetic, environmental, and lifestyle factors primarily determine the lifespan of humans. From these, nutrition is a key component affecting our health. And unlike, there's always people's opinions, and Lord knows the internet is just absolutely horribly filled with people's personal opinions on what diet is the right thing, what exercise is the right thing to do. And the answer is they don't know because it depends on the individual and what their limitations are. And what we do is we overgeneralize, and what happens is we're going to not have the results that we could have if we had proper population identification and application of that population with the right exercise or the right nutrition. So a prime example is if I'm looking at somebody where I've done an RMR, a resting metabolic rate on someone, and they're burning 70% carbohydrate at rest, I will have a totally different set of nutritional recommendations for them than I would with somebody who's 70% fat and 30% carbohydrate. Um, and without that information, you wouldn't know. And this is the real value of metabolic analysis is you have not a clue until you get the results. You have no idea prior to the test what you're going to find. And you can't make any really good decisions and recommendations without the baseline information. And none of these are made based upon VO2 max. That's the fun part, is there's a lot of other data that you need to look at for it to be effective. So we can see nutrition and exercise. We all know they're extremely important, especially related to longevity and health. So what does a metabolic analyzer do? Well, number one, the first thing that I do with my guys is I do a resting metabolic rate test. Some people do metabolic or VO2, and I'm always shaking my head going, you're leaving so much on the table. You must do both because you may find that they're perfectly the information that you get at rest doesn't provide the information of anything of how they perform during exercise. And you need both sides of the information to be able to make nutritional and exercise recommendations. So I always do a resting metabolic rate on my people, and it is the gold standard for accurately determining resting metabolic rates and metabolic health at rest. Um, and by metabolic health, I mean the ability to find out what percentage of fat versus carbohydrate they burn at rest. A diabetic or a pre-diabetic will be burning significantly more carbohydrate at rest than fat. Um, Without testing using this gold standard method, you would not know that. The other tests that you do with this device is obviously looking at a VO2 max test. Again, I hate that because it just focuses everybody on the VO2 max score. I prefer to it is called like active testing versus resting testing. It's a much better way of doing it. There's so much out there when it comes to terminology that is just wrong. And because it's been around for so long, it's really hard to get rid of. It goes, if you think back just to aerobic versus anaerobic metabolism, and you're going, that's been proven to be wrong years ago, tens of years ago. And yet we're still using that. Still talk about aerobic and anaerobic systems, and you're going, no, there's no such thing as this. So that's my own pet peeve when it comes to, VO2 max testing is people, that's all they think of it. But it is the gold standard to accurately determine a VO2 max. Um, Come on, you. It's the strongest independent predictor of health and longevity in healthy and unhealthy populations. And that's why most people are interested in it. Now, to me, okay, it's been the bane of my existence for the last 5 years since this was announced. It helps sell product, but the fact is that people will just do the testing to get that number, and yet it needs to be cross-correlated with so many other things. But at least we have a physical test versus a blood test that that could be an independent predictor. So I'm happy that it actually does that job well. And if that's what all people get from it, that's very good in itself. But I want to start promoting the fact that metabolic analysis gives you so much more information, and that we need to stop just oversimplifying this piece of information. Because a high VO2 max, obviously, if you look at the other factors that we discussed, is usually means that they eat fairly well, they sleep fairly well, they exercise somewhat on a regular basis, which also means they probably live in a area that's more affluent than others. And some of these also cross-correlate with educational levels and everything else. So we can look at the societal things as well. So the VO2 max doesn't just represent that number; it represents habits. And I think it goes back to those first slides of going, you need to be able to adjust all these factors to be able to actually be healthy. It's also the gold standard for identifying fuel source switches used to accurately set training zones. And this is something that I try and get across to people. One of the most important decisions you make in exercise is intensity. And intensities are usually based upon zones, so training zones. Well, they're inherently wrong. Sometimes they're just by luck correct. But not only that, um, you can zone wrong even though you've done a metabolic analysis test if you reuse the wrong methods. And my concern is people are getting out there and they're getting VO2 max tests done. And what the person's doing is not any analysis of the data, they're just allowing the algorithm to select the zones. And for example, one of the best methods, according to the research out there, is using anaerobic threshold. And anaerobic threshold requires O2 and CO2 metrics, and it finds a very simple point on a trend line and it marks it. One point over a 9 to 12 minute test, of which it's multiplied by percentages. So you're using science to identify a point and then you're using math. So it's not an embracing of science. And if anybody has a respiratory limitation, the anaerobic threshold will be wrong. It won't be wrong. It'll be identified correctly, but it'll be there for a different reason. And therefore, the zoning will be off. And therefore, the person's going to get recommendations to train at an inappropriate intensity to be able to change their health, function, or performance. So, but this is what the device is capable of doing, all of which is the reason why I started doing this about 30 years ago, was I needed those answers to be able to best work with my clients. So how does an RMR work? It's usually people are doing way too short of RMRs. For example, on this one here, you can see the test results ended at 10 minutes. It's too short of an RMR. RMRs to be accurate, you might need to do about 20 minutes because it takes that long for the person to be able to relax and settle in. Um, but this is the type of data that you need to get an RMR. Now, what's really important here is that to get an RMR, you only need VO2. But to be able to get other information, you need both a measurement of the CO2 you're breathing out and your O2 that you're utilizing. And that relationship is referred to as your RER. So it's the equivalence of the CO2 you're producing versus the O2 you're utilizing. And this is a really important piece of information as far as looking at metabolic health. So how does it do this? It's referred to as indirect calorimetry. Calorimetry, geez, I have a hard time with that one. And it relies on the fact that burning one kilocalorie requires 208.06 milliliters of oxygen. And because of that direct relationship between the oxygen consumed and caloric burn, it's virtually interchangeable. So unlike other BMRs or RMRs that are measured through, for example, the attempts to give you an accurate RMR through, let's say, body composition, it is innately inaccurate. All they've done is they took RMR data and tried to make their measurements on their device come close to the RMR measured on the gold standard. But there is only one true way of measuring a BMR or RMR, and that is by doing indirect calorimetry, and that's using a metabolic analyzer. And then it needs to be accurate. So oxygen uptake requires a precise measurement of the volume of air, expired air, and the concentration of oxygen in the inspired versus expired. So you need a really accurate device that can be calibrated to the room and then calibrated to the person, and then be able to measure those the factors of oxygen consumption to be able to accurately get an idea of the number of kilocalories the person's burning at rest. Now, if you have O2 and CO2, it provides a percentage of calories that you burn from fat versus carbohydrate. And this is extremely important, again, about looking at metabolic health. So that ability to be able to state that my expectation is that all people should have at least burn at least 70% fat versus 30% carbohydrate at rest. If you are below that, we have to do something. It's a real metabolic limitation, and we need to train your metabolic systems, which means it helps select what exercise prescription I give. But I can't give a proper exercise prescription unless I know your zones, and I can only get that by doing the active test as well. So that's what I mean about the importance of having both done. So uh, this is basically how it works: is measuring the gases and being able to determine a couple of different things: how many calories you burn at rest, and therefore the ability to apply that to your nutritional requirements itself. So what does RMR testing tell us? On your right here is an example of a report. So you can look at this as we're going through, but it provides us an accurate BMR, and a basal metabolic rate is the number of calories that you burn for your basic survival. In other words, for your heart to be, for you to be able to breathe, um, for you to be able to digest. So that's the BMR. So it provides you that in order so that you can be able to set proper caloric goals depending on what you're looking for is weight loss, maintenance, or weight gain. So that's the first thing that, and obviously extremely important to anybody who's handling nutrition. So for this particular person, their BMR was 3020. They obviously need to be able, their professional activity, they're quite busy, is 906 calories. I disregard the exercise because it depends on what intensity and duration they're doing. But in order for them to be able to maintain their calories based upon just going to work and just surviving is 3,926. It's a high number, but if you also look at the size of the individual, you'll understand why. So it provides you with that information for you to use. It also allows us to compare their BMR to others, their age, and gender, height, and weight. So in this particular case, this person, uh, their rate was faster than others with the same height and weight. Again, why is this important? It helps us determine the importance of resistance training versus other exercise options. Again, an overgeneralization that people that are obese should do resistance training. You don't know that. The only way to know is if their metabolic rate is slower than others in the same grouping, then you know that they have decreased lean muscle mass, and thereby doing resistance training, you can improve their lean muscle mass and then improve their metabolic rate. And that will help them with the weight loss that they're probably struggling with. But I find that if you have a highly active person who is obese, they're busy carrying 20, 40, 60 pounds on their back everywhere they go. They actually have fairly good lean muscle mass in relation to their fat mass. So the priority with people like that, it tells me I'll concentrate more on improving their metabolic health and losing weight through addressing the nutrition and their exercise prescription, but it will not be a priority of resistance training with that person. So it's not just putting out the reports and showing people and they enter it into their tracker. It tells you what exercise programming is a priority. It also tells us that fat to carbohydrate use at rest is a marker of metabolic health. As I stated before, if they come back and they're burning an excessive amount of carbohydrate at rest, again, different exercise nutrition approach with that person. All from a RMR testing, just from the resting test itself. And it also provides us a clear indication to our client's metabolic health at rest, which helps us to determine the priority of exercise selection. So that's the RMR. What about the active tests, which again, other people refer to as VO2? They describe it as a cardiovascular fitness, and I would agree the VO2 max is more cardiorespiratory or cardiopulmonary, depending on how you look at it. But really, what we want to do is we want to take the information and look at their cardiovascular system, their respiratory system, and their metabolic systems separately and how they interact. In other words, you have a respiratory problem, it will have profound effects on your metabolic and your cardiovascular performance. If you have a cardiovascular problem, it'll have an effect on your respiratory and metabolic. We've oversimplified this for the population by stating that, if I test a VO2 max, you're healthy. Hmm, no, not necessarily at all. And if you end up looking like you have poor metabolic health, it might be entirely due to a respiratory limitation. And a classic example of that is if a person has a respiratory limitation and they lack good tidal volume, they will tend to hyperventilate. If they hyperventilate, they will decrease CO2 levels at the muscle, and therefore you will not get the diffusion of O2 off the hemoglobin into the cell. It becomes an offloading problem, and the O2 will leave on the hemoglobin. So hyperventilation can lead to metabolic issues or looking like metabolic issues, as well as obviously effects on the cardiovascular health because of the fact that it will cause venous dilation, which will lead to pooling, which will lead to decreased return to the heart, which will lead to decreased stroke volume. So it's amazing how respiratory limitation will affect those. And I mean, if you look at the brain, hyperventilation has profound effects on the brain's your ability to think and make good decisions. So these are the three different systems, and I wish the people who did metabolic analysis did look at each of these systems because there is individual information by looking at different metrics within the test to be able to look at each of these systems separately and how they interact. So it's much more complex than people make it out to be. And it's not just VO2 max. Good God, no. And I test many people with high VO2 maxes who are completely unhealthy. They have huge respiratory limitations, which have metabolic limitations, but they have a high VO2 max. So it's not all that it's cut out to be, and it's not the only piece of information that you should be wanting to get from physiological testing. So what does physiological testing tell us? And over here, I just have an example of a first page from a report from one of the guys I tested. Well, it allows us to differentiate what system or systems are limiting the client's health, function, or performance. And I like looking at them because my medical guys, I'm after health. My general population, I'm after improving function. And my athletes, I'm after improving performance. So really, it'll be one of those three. And hopefully we'll walk them from health to function to performance in the end. But obviously, one of the things we want it to do is, yes, it gives us a VO2 max. And yes, it does allow us to compare that person's VO2 max to others, their age and gender, which is really good. But really, that's the end of that page for that. Really, what's important is identifying which system's the limiter and accurately identifying zones. Because your exercise prescription will be related to the limitation, the goal of your training related to the limitation, and the intensity of their workouts. And the intensity will be based upon providing them with accurate zones. So it will also allow us to determine accurate zones using changes in fuel source if you've got O2 and CO2. If you're being tested by, there's plenty of devices out there now that just measure O2. They cannot tell you fuel source. You need the relationship between the CO2 you're producing and the O2 that you're using to be able to determine fuel source. So with a proper device, it allows you to be able to set your zones because you can see as the person switches from one type of fuel source contribution to another or biasing to a higher amount of your ATP or energy that's being created by a different fuel source, you know that's a zone switch. and it's the best way of zoning. And yeah, it's a bit complicated, but no, it's not because it's all defendable using basic physiology. The fact is that, for example, when you start burning lactate, and let's say you're still burning fat, you're still burning sugars, you start burning more lactate because ATP needs to be created at a faster rate. So it starts kicking in all these other systems as in order to be able to meet the rate requirement. Well, what will happen is you'll use as much lactate as your system can use, and then it'll start to accumulate. And you're going, yeah, that happens to everybody. That's why I don't like lactate. Of course, it's going to go up. It's supposed to go up when that system is hit its limit of how much it can do. But when you become acidotic, which is not due to lactate accumulation, but hydrogen ions, your mechanoreceptors, your chemoreceptors tell your respiratory system to breathe more quickly. So you're going to see a respiratory frequency change in relation to a change of fuel source system. One of my pet peeves is the fact of everybody reading that they should breathe through the nose and breathe slowly, and you're going, no, no. You use the big hole in the front of your face when you're exercising, and for God's sakes, allow your systems to work to be able to drive your breathing frequencies up in order to deal with the biochemical changes that are happening at the muscle cell. So that's a whole other side topic. It also allows us to focus exercise prescription type and intensity to eliminate or minimize the client's limitation effectively and efficiently, thereby improving their health, function, and performance. So it allows us to identify it, get accurate zones, and then prescribe the right exercise to be able to make the physiological changes. And yes, we can do that. The fact is, if we have a low VO2 max, there's a specific type of training that I would do to move that. If they have poor metabolic health, there's a specific type of training that I would do specifically for improving their metabolic health. So that's a lovely part of doing metabolic analysis and doing active testing. But it also tells us some things that we don't think about, which is also it'll tell us the amount and type of fuel used at different intensities, which is vital to accurately tracking nutrition and nutrition planning. So we all guess, all of our watches guess how many calories you burned at exercise and what percentage are fat and carbohydrate. With our testing and application into a smartwatch system or smart system, we can accurately determine at very specific heart rates how many calories you're burning in total and what percentage are fat versus carbohydrate. So by importing this into the system, an accurate VO2 max, accurate zones, an accurate fuel use, an accurate BMR, now all of a sudden you're dealing with real data specific to the individual, and we can properly track their exercise and their nutrition. So I find this to be extremely important. For my athletes, they love this because of the fact, of course, that they can do race planning and training planning for nutrition. If they know they're going to go out and their zone two is between, 130, 135, well, it won't be because they're burning too much carbohydrate. Let's say they're between 112 and 118. They can calculate how many calories that they require per hour, per minute, grams, whatever method that they want to be able to look at. If they want kilocalories per hour, kilocalories per minute, or grams, you can provide that information. And what's nice is transferring that information over to the smart side of the house is already in place. But be aware, device companies and testing centers see a market. And you just watch over the last 6 years, there's been a huge number of people trying to make money off of discussions of, let's say, breath training. It's gone nuts, and I have to undo it 90% of the time what people they think they're doing correctly. The other is that there's a lot of companies out there recently who really are putting out cheap devices that are inaccurate, um, and therefore kind of muddying the waters from something that I've been deeply involved in for 30 years. And be very careful because as soon as the market is being seen, especially with the internet, it's being taken advantage of. And be aware of companies and testing centers if you're being tested. Be aware of what you need to keep an eye open for to ensure that you're getting accurate and reliable information. Many devices are not accurate, nor offer both O2 and CO2. One of the most popular devices out right now is O2 only. And you're going, but you don't have any nutrition information. And you're leaving so much on the table with that as well. So be careful about paying attention to the devices that are out there. Look for O2 and CO2 and make sure they're using high quality equipment. Many users don't know how to test, analyze, and prescribe. It's absolutely amazing to me that people are putting out the kind of money that they are in order to offer testing, but they have no idea what the protocols they should be using. They have no idea of what to do with the data except for what the reports punch out through algorithms. And they certainly don't even go to the point where they prescribe any recommendations except for, "Oh, here's your zones, see you later," because they don't know what information they've collected. Most complete only basic analysis. So they'll give you VO2 max and they'll select some method of zoning that is algorithmic, but they won't go in and say, they have no idea whether you have a respiratory limitation. They have no idea how your metabolic health is, which is a real drag because that information with a proper device is all there. And there's overgeneralization of recommendations. And I mean, a classic is this. Now everybody's supposed to do zone two. I dealt with the high intensity interval training for years, knowing no, it's poisoning a lot of people. Zone two is a little safer, but no, I don't know whether you need to do zone two. I don't know whether you need to do high intensity interval until I test you. So it's just overgeneralization in recommendations that are out there. And mainly because there's ways of making money with it. So be aware, most only complete a basic analysis. On the zoning side, again, it's there's so much information and there's so much better ways of zoning that's available, but nobody does it because it takes an extra 5 minutes to be able to look at the data and be able to identify it. So it's really important that if you are going to go out there, you need the person doing your review needs to know what they're doing. Many do not have an answer for issues found. So, for example, even if they did find a respiratory limitation, they'd have no recommendations to what you should do about it. They certainly will not define the priority of resistance versus zone 2, 3, 4, or 5, which is a real drag because there is definitive answers for any limitation found. But many of them do not have an answer for them. As I stated, specifically respiratory. I have been doing respiratory training for over 20 years. I do not use any of the methods that have become popular in the last 10 years, mainly because they're not grounded in physiology. The application of breathing techniques used at rest do not apply to exercise. And yet people are doing it all the time. The physiology between deep diving has nothing to do with breathing. In fact, it's not breathing. So trying to apply these theories makes absolutely no sense, and it's really screwing a lot of people up. And without accurate testing equipment, first of all, then the protocols, the test protocols, effective analysis, and the knowledge of nutrition and exercise prescription, the data is at best useless, but potentially misleading. And it doesn't have to be. There's nothing wrong with the data. The data is really good. It's the how people are doing it. So what's the answer to these problems? If you're looking for testing, find out what they're using and find out what you can expect from the analysis and results. If you're looking to investing in testing, invest in the right equipment from the beginning. I tell lots of people that have not they think they're going to spend a certain amount. I tell them, wait 6 months, wait a year, find different investors, but for God's sakes, invest in the right equipment from the beginning, and then learn to maximize the data. And a lot of people, what I'm quite famous for out there is I run a physiological testing analysis and nutrition exercise program and certification program. So you own one of these expensive boxes. Now take my certification program and I'll teach you everything from physiology through to exercise prescription, and how to maximize your results with your clients. And that's my presentation.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Unfortunately, we are also almost running out of time. We had scheduled 1 hour, so maybe we can.
Tough to do all this in 1 hour, that's for sure.
That was absolutely fascinating, and you had so many things to say. Difficult to put all of them in 30 minutes, which I perfectly understand. Um, do you guys have any questions, Jean-Baptiste, Will? We can maybe spend 5 to 10 additional minutes to cover some questions.
That'd be wonderful.
Or I can be the icebreaker here. So what I understand, Daniel, is that VO2 max is just one small portion of the reality that we need to understand and to take into consideration. Things seem to be a little bit more complex than that unique number. Um, you have some facilities, I understand, and you can interpret the data, but how do we use the kind of knowledge that you have just discussed about when we are in different countries? I mean, you're in England. We don't. I don't know if you have. We have testing devices here or laboratories. Um, do we have to buy something? How much does it cost? In terms of practical insights, how could we get tested and take value out of this?
I think because of the fact that I work with a lot of athletes around the world, I'm doing the same thing. I'm going, where am I going to get this guy tested so I can use really good data, right? Um, Obviously, we can first of all seek out whether there is somebody who owns a core device or equivalent device that gives me O2 and CO2 accurately. Um, I can help. In a lot of cases, I jump in and say, if you're not doing the protocol this way, this is what I need. And they just send me what's referred to as a CC4 file, and then I do the analysis. So I'll do the analysis prescription. But a lot of people with the device, and my education program is not specific to core. Mine is open to anyone who owns any device. Even if they just own O2, I'll explain to them what they can get out of O2 versus CO2 itself. So I'm happy to try. If you're interested in being tested, you can always send me an email with your location, and I'll try and find the closest place for you to be
Okay.
tested.
Okay,
And
that's interesting. I live in France, in the south of France, and I happen to know that in Paris there's a laboratory called R45, I think. And
yeah,
I've discussed
R15.
R15, yes, of course. Yes,
I
excuse me,
was I was on
R15,
a
exactly.
I was on a call with him yesterday.
Yes, George Cosmo.
George, yeah. Yeah, so I was on a call with him yesterday to discuss what we're talking about, and he's wanting to make some changes. So,
Yes, okay. So that's interesting. So do you think the devices that he is using are reliable enough to do the testing as you would like to and you recommend to?
yeah, I mean, George, I believe, uses Pinoy, um, and,
Mm,
and as long as that device is working well that day,
yeah,
um,
sure.
yeah, that's one of the issues is reliability. But if he is, then I can use the data and work with him and whatever client happens to be in Paris.
Okay, so that's an answer to my question. I happen to travel to Paris from time to time, and I could use the time that when I'm there to do the testing and then um, do the interpretation eventually with you. What's the
One other
yes?
option, Gabrielle, is that because of the area that I cover, is actually coordinating a practical um, uh, like a day practical in different areas itself, in which those that are interested in actually investing in metabolic analysis, like a testing center, um, we can get together and you can get a chance to experience it as well. I have a lot of people that travel all over the UK up here to spend time with me on a weekend
Mm,
uh, to go through the testing itself. But in the end, it's for those people that are interested in investing in the device and they want to really maximize their use of it. The best thing to do is reach out to me through Core. We can have a conversation how we can do that. If you're more interested, that's why I put two sides to this. If you're more interested
mhm.
on getting a hold of me for to discuss metabolic testing, um, or doing analysis for you, then that's more on the strategic health. But if you're actually really, if you're interested in going, I would really like to invest in this in the future, be able to provide it, but I'm concerned that I don't have the knowledge to do so. Reach out to me through Core, and we can work out something.
Yeah, interesting. So let me think about this, and I will get back to you. I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now with all sorts of different projects, longevity related projects, a conference. We are going to have here in Aix-en-Provence in at the beginning of September, an investment fund where we fund longevity startups, more on the biotech side, to be honest, but the whole spectrum overall. So it's taken a big chunk of my time. But as these things will be sorted out, I will be really interested to look into this. And um, I've
But
thought also,
do you
yes.
see a role for me there?
Certainly, but it's difficult to define it so far,
Okay.
because there are so many directions that this can take, and we only have so much time in a day.
Yeah.
So I think it's a little bit premature to discuss about this, but again, it's important to keep this top of mind and to take it again into consideration seriously in a couple of months, uh, according to my schedule and what I can imagine in terms of bandwidth.
Okay. Sounds good.
Thank you very much, Daniel. It was brilliant, lots of information. We should have taken 2 hours, not one, to ask also the many questions that I personally had, at least.
Right on. Well, if they want to get a hold of me, if they didn't get their questions out, they can certainly reach out to me.
Yes. Okay. Perfect.